This episode is not just about Nigel Farage, who appears on the thumbnail of it, but more broadly, we're going to look at the right-wing authoritarian populism that is gaining sway around the world. That is exemplified in the US by phenomenon of Trump's MAGA movement across Europe, and in the UK by Farage's latest pop-up populist party reform, and of course by Tommy Robinson, a far-right firebrand. This episode explores the assets, agents, and useful idiots of the Kremlin that seek to leverage this wave of populism, and what we know about the support and financing of extremist movements, politicians, and contrarian voices by the Kremlin. We dive into the phenomenon of paradigm-shifting pop-up populist parties that often resemble Kremlin projects, such as Reform UK, Farage, and his associates. Especially, we explore the topic through the lens of Pekka Kallioniemi and his Vatnik Soup series of profiles, which sadly has come to an end, publishing its final episode this week. And if you want to hear from him, we did do an interview last week, which is on the channel. Let's start with core dynamics, why right-wing authoritarian populism is in the ascendancy. Crisis of legitimacy and inequality. The 2008 financial crisis, growing inequality, institutional disillusionment, these cracked the centre ground of politics and made anti-elite narratives far more potent. Kallioniemi notes that this is, or could be called, the golden age of populism, and it begins in the 2010s with Trump, Brexit, Orban, etc. Voters felt left behind by technocratic elites. Populist rhetoric claims to speak for the people versus the corrupt elite. This has always been around, but we saw an intensification in the years following the financial crisis. Then there's the cultural backlash and identity politics. Globalization, migration, and changes of social norms have provoked a reaction. Many populist actors frame their causes as defending our people, our values, our identity from external and domestic elites. This is a classic authoritarian playbook we've seen in the past, and it has resurfaced with a vengeance in the modern age. The reversed post-material thesis theorizes that right-wing populism gained ground when mainstream parties shifted towards post-material values. For instance, LGBT, environmentalism, etc., creating space for reactionary, highly conservative, identity-based politics. That's from Wikipedia. And a vacuum of traditional policies addressing material and social concerns of the majority, and especially of the working classes. Without representation, they drifted and sought other outlets who claimed to represent them. Now, we'll examine this later. The pop-up populists often will offer simple solutions to complex problems, but they have a veneer of plausibility about them. Then there's the media ecosystems and amplification. Populists are adept at viral strategies, grievance media, social platforms, and algorithmic amplification. And just on cue, the technology has appeared to allow this to happen at a tremendous, unheard of scale. Messaging is designed to provoke, polarize, and bypass traditional gatekeepers. The Kremlin's disinformation machinery, bots, troll farms, amplifiers further boost sympathetic voices. They amplify bubbles of opinion which become ever more concentrated, and they seed narratives into this group. This technology allows it to be done at a scale that has never been possible before. Then there are foundational weaknesses in liberal democracy. The checks and balances, press freedoms, regulatory constraints, and fragmentation make liberal systems vulnerable to infiltration, narrative disruption, and the normalization of extreme views. As populists begin to touch power, institutions may be hollowed out from within or reversed via authoritarian maneuvers. Some watching won't like this, but we are seeing this process playing out in the US in real time. Part 2, the Kremlin's toolkit, assets, agents, useful idiots, and influence. To understand how Moscow has, in many cases, tried to tilt politics, we organize the Kremlin's influence apparatus into categories. And we're tackling this now because it's extremely timely, a very close colleague of Nigel Farage in Reform, has just been prosecuted for clear links to the Kremlin and monetary benefit for spreading Russian narratives. So this is an absolute case in point, and strangely is not being touched hardly at all by the mainstream media in the UK. Well, let's dive into assets, direct or state-linked entities. Well, one we've covered on the channel before, Pravfond is a Russian legal defense foundation. Leaked documents show that Pravfond officially backs Russian expatriate and compatriot causes, but it also finances propaganda sites. It covers legal defense costs for convicted Russians who perpetuate Russian interests, for instance, Viktor Bart and Vadim Krasikov, and employs former intelligence operatives within its networks. European security services view it as a Kremlin influence arm operating across 48 countries. That was reported in The Guardian. Then there are state or semi-state media, diplomatic channels and grants. RT, Sputnik and their successors, though they are banned in some countries, are classic instruments of narrative export. Then there's cultural diplomacy, NGOs, Russian compatriot programs, Rostrudnichestvo, grants, academic and exchange funds frequently act as soft power permeation tools. And finally, in this segment, we have legal or non-profit foundations linked to Moscow may be used as cover to channel funds or coordinate influence operations. Then we have the category of agents, intermediaries, promoters, network nodes, political operatives and ideological brokers. For instance, Steve Bannon in Vatnik Soup, Kallioniemi profiles Bannon as someone who has attempted to unify far-right pro-Putin parties across Europe. He is described as flooding the zone with shit in influencing narratives, again from Vatnik Soup. And in the UK, we have Aaron Banks, often cited in debates about the UK-Russia nexus. Kallioniemi's series includes Banks as a node of key influence in this web of often right-wing and possibly Kremlin-aligned narratives. And finally, we have these useful idiots, amplifiers, apologists. Those are persons or voices who adopt, repeat, or legitimize Kremlin narratives, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. Kallioniemi's Vatnik Soup is primarily a catalogue of these actors. They include public intellectuals, commentators, conspiracy theorists, podcasters, journalists, fringe politicians, and even mainstream media personalities sympathetic to Russia or soft on its aggression. And then we have the core topic of this episode, populist parties and movements as vehicles. Populist political projects, especially newer or fringe parties, can be vehicles for narratives favourable to Moscow, or at least for topics that distract from Russia's actions, for instance, anti-NATO, anti-war, anti-Ukraine, anti-sanctions. Sometimes that is dressed up as we just want peace, etc., etc., but it mounts to the same thing, and that is to persuade people not to mount a defence of their own interests in the face of Russian aggression. Once these parties gain influence, they can act as multipliers in parliamentary votes, alliances, blocking motions in debates, and of course shaping the wider discourse. Now let's turn to support and financing, known patterns and challenges. While there are often opaque financing and legal gaps, The Guardian, Follow the Money, found that about a quarter of private donations in the EU between 2019 to 2022 went to extremist populist parties. That amounts to about 150 million euros, with transparently weak oversight in many of those jurisdictions. Loopholes in party funding laws, especially cross-border funding, shell organisations and shadow networks, make detection difficult. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling to close such gaps, citing loopholes in EU party financing legislation and elite capture. There are, of course, if we turn to something like the Brexit vote, there are persistent fears that a huge amount of below-the-radar funding was channeled towards the Leave cause, and we still haven't fully mapped the extent of that, way beyond what the limitations of what was allowed, way beyond the limitations of what was legally allowed for that campaign. Then there is incentive alignment rather than direct handouts. The Kremlin often uses narrative alignment, rhetorical cover, or indirect facilitation rather than heavy, overt funding to maintain plausible deniability and reduce blowback. There are historic precedents and documented interventions, however. Analyses, for instance, Putin's populist studies, trace the Kremlin's historical support for right-wing populist parties in Europe to sow discord, weaken Western cohesion, and create favourable blocs that will promote and inject its narratives. In many European settings, parties formerly friendly to Russia have leveraged that relationship when convenient, though some have pivoted away post-2022 as Russia became more toxic in public discourse. Mutual utility versus loyalty. Not all populist parties received Russian support are fully controlled. Often relationships are transactional. The party benefits from narrative and structural support. Moscow gains presence. Over time, dependencies may grow. And in the era of crypto and digital campaign finances, there is a possibility that some material support can be provided, but completely below the radar. Now we get to the third part here. UK, US, Europe, how populist right-wing projects mimic Kremlin tactics. Well, let's start with the United Kingdom, Farage, Reform and Company. Farage's latest vehicle for his ego and his political ambitions, Reform UK, is a pop-up party phenomenon. Reform UK is often viewed as a pop-up or recombinant populist project. It has thin institutional roots, heavy reliance on media presence, niche radical platform, and it scales fast. Its trajectory resembles what influence networks sometimes engineer. Create something disruptive, attract the media, capture discontent, and then normalize. Do it all quickly before people start to realize that this is not a coherent or powerful project. Farage and his associates are regularly scrutinized for past engagements with Russia and Russian sympathetic platforms, and it seems that that is happening at an extraordinary scale now. The party is barely a year old or so, and already scandals are starting to emerge. Farage and his associates are regularly scrutinized for past engagements with Russia and Russia-sympathetic platforms, for instance, appearances on RT. Some investigative journalists, for instance, Peter Jukes, who indeed we featured on the channel last week in Byline Times and other publications, highlight the connections or proximity of Leave.eu figures such as Banks and Wigmore to Russian contacts, though direct smoking gun financing is legally contested, and we still need more evidence to join those dots. Kallioniemi's Vatnik Soup identifies figures in the UK milieu as useful idiots in propagating Kremlin narratives, i.e. soft stances towards Ukraine sanctions, skeptical of NATO, amplifying Russian talking points. But this is a sliding scale. As more evidence emerges, it may be that key UK figures move from being useful idiots to actual Kremlin assets and even agents. Then there is narrative framing and media amplification. Reform and aligned voices often frame themselves as patriots, opposing overreaching elites, globalism, and the establishment, tropes that overlap with Russian soft power messaging. But this is where I want to inject some of my own personal opinion. The values of intolerance, the values of exclusivity, the values of divisiveness and distrust, they are inherently not British values, I would argue. So whereas they are superficially attractive, their populist policies offering simple solutions to complex problems, their tone which blames others for the problems, not the rich elites or policies themselves, but minorities that are defenseless, this is intrinsically not part, I would say, of the British character, and yet it is gaining huge traction. Unfortunately, for many of the reasons that we highlighted earlier, they do represent a betrayal of, I would say, the fundamental character of this nation and what we should be aspiring to. Media platforms sympathetic to populism or with weak guardrails help to amplify their messaging. These platforms may also serve as echo chambers for narratives about Ukraine, NATO, sanctions, migration, vaccines, identity, etc., which often overlap with Russian talking points. Then there is the situation in the United States with MAGA, Trump, Bannon, and soft pro-Russian channels. These are some of the core actors within the Vatnik Soup series. Kallioniemi profiles Steve Bannon, as we mentioned above, as a transatlantic broker of pro-Putin narratives. Although that's not all he peddles, it's a complex mixture, attempting to network far-right movements around Europe. Other American commentators and media figures who echo pro-Russian narratives, for instance, skepticism of Ukraine aid, criticism of sanctions, promoting conspiracy narratives, are chronicled in the Vatnik Soup threads. Tucker Carlson, of course, would be a classic example of this. Then there is symmetry of narrative and policy. Trump's America First rhetoric, skepticism of alliances, and occasional praise or soft posture towards Putin create convergence with Russian interests. The 2025 ex-Putin advisor Sergei Markov opined that populist forces in the US undermine Europe's establishment and are very much in Russia's interests. Then there's the digital media, conspiracy ecosystem, and amplifiers. Again, we are at an inflection point in history where the technology has allowed these things to become possible when previously they weren't. Populist and contrarian media in the US sometimes amplifies narratives that dovetail with Kremlin messaging, war fatigue, anti-Ukraine aid, sanctions hypocrisy, etc. The big one, of course, is this is all making you poorer. Why do you even sort of bother? This is placing individual interest over societal values and any kind of political morality or even strategy. Some conspiracy networks further spread disinformation, which resonates with Kremlin influence goals. Then there is Europe more broadly, because we see the same patterns on a different scale, albeit, but we've seen the same patterns across Europe. A structural shift in foreign policy stances. ECFR's rise to the challenges argues that populist parties across Europe increasingly contest the post-Cold War foreign policy consensus. More Euroscepticism, skepticism of NATO, conditional alignment with Russia and China, selective foreign partnerships. This is all a threat, clearly, to defense and deterrence. They often frame their foreign policies as prioritizing national sovereignty over multilateralism or Atlanticist hegemony. This is also language which will be very familiar with anyone that pays attention to Russian foreign policy propaganda. Then there are electoral gains and influence. Populist, radical right, or anti-establishment parties have topped or performed strongly in many European democracies. Germany, France, Italy, Hungary, Poland. That's according to the European Council on Foreign Relations. Their parliamentary presence allows them to block, delay, or condition foreign policy decisions, defence spending, or EU-level consensus supporting Ukraine. It also enables things like trying to enforce sanctions or close all the loopholes on sanctions. It makes that far more difficult. That's according to the Atlantic Council. Then there's Russia's willing partners and narrative convergence. Russia's identified and cultivated parties that echo its interests, rejecting sanctions, questioning narratives about Ukraine, pushing anti-NATO sentiment. These parties are seen as willing partners in Europe. After 2022, some parties have recalibrated. It's true, they have distanced themselves, but many continue to traffic in pro-Russia or ambivalent rhetoric that nonetheless ladders up to Russia's foreign policy. The article, What Happened to Putin's Friends? The Radical Right's Recalibration, explores how formerly Russia-friendly parties have responded. The policies may not have fundamentally changed, they just need to change their clothing, the packaging, and the tone of those. But we need to look at whether those policies are substantially different or whether they are still Kremlin aligned, even if the language in which they are described has changed. Then there's funding and structural fragility. The Guardian's analysis that 1 in 4 private donations in the EU went to extremist and populist parties underscores how much private money now fuels these movements. The financial backbone combined with weak oversight, allows rapid growth of parties that otherwise might lack any kind of institutional depth or take hold. Let's turn now to the phenomenon of pop-up populist parties and Kremlin-style projects. Well, let's start with the definition and characteristics. Pop-up populist parties are those which emerge quickly, often around a charismatic figure or media brand, with thin institutional roots, heavy reliance on messaging and media, and limited internal structure. They can be agile, provocative, and attention-driven. They often resemble influence operations, create disruption rather than long-term governance structures. And if we dig into their policies, well, we find often they are fairly incoherent and benefit not the broad mass of a population, but small niches, often very wealthy niches within it. Why do they appeal then? Well, they're faster to adapt, faster to shift narratives and exploit electoral niches. They work at the speed of social media, which traditional parties do not. They have lower bureaucratic baggage, enabling more radical or flexible stances. They're easier to seed from external support. They're easier to amplify through social media platforms or networks of activists. They serve as amplifiers of grievances. They do not offer coherent solutions and insurgent overlay on existing fault lines. A case study here, of course, is Reform UK, with Farage and his associates. Reform UK is often cited as a prime example of this, emerging rapidly, relying on high-profile media presence, associations with Brexit network sites, building on previous generations of pop-up parties, each one refining its messaging, its brand, and moving at a greater speed and with greater momentum. And they are, of course, drawing from major discontent. In this instance, there is the extraordinary irony that they are drawing on the discontent created by the disruptions of Brexit, the very thing which Nigel Farage helped to bring about. Now he's capitalising on the poverty, chaos, and division that brought about to build his further political profile. Investigation by commentators, Dukes and Byline Times tie certain UK populist actors to past Russia contacts or soft pro-Russia rhetoric. In the Vatnik Soup ecosystem, UK actors aligned with soft or revisionist views on Ukraine and NATO are catalogued as potential useful idiots, as we've mentioned, voices whose amplification matters more than formal connection. But that may just be because we are not aware of the formal connections. They are plausibly deniable. There is also a process here of institutional cover-up, institutional amnesia, which means that those connections, those potential connections, are not even being researched, and they're certainly not being talked about in the mainstream media. Well, let's turn next to transnational influence and mimicry. Pop-up parties often import messaging templates, network consultants, online strategies, and meme frameworks from successful models. We have an authoritarian toolkit, which is what I've been talking about on this channel for a long time. In the US, there's MAGA, we have European identitarianism, Russian disinformation playbooks. This makes them de facto junior partners in a broad ecosystem of populist media and ideological warfare, which is now a global phenomenon. It is part of an authoritarian toolkit, an authoritarian learning system. Then there are challenges and vulnerabilities. Many of these pop-up parties lack the ability to govern. We see that in the UK. How many reform councillors that came to power in a huge wave voted in during the last election, how many of them have either dropped out or resigned amid scandal, incompetence, and calamity? Well, they lack policy depth, they lack institutional competence, and of course, coalition discipline. They're dependent on media money flows. Shock to funding or any kind of access platform denial can provide a serious disruption to their activities and popularity. When scandals or contradictions emerge, and hopefully we're seeing this in the UK, they can unravel rapidly. They are vulnerable as well to infiltration, capture, or exposure, especially if external influence is revealed. Well, let's look at this through the Vatnik Soup lens. Here are some key illustrative profiles and lessons. Well, first, the scope of Vatnik Soup. Even though Pekka is moving away from doing this series now, they will stand there as a testament, as a reference, a kind of encyclopedia of Russian useful idiots, assets, and agents. It's a prolific series of threads. Now it's a book curating profiles of people, media outlets, influencers, and organizations that either align with or amplify Russian narratives. It functions as a crowdsourced disinformation route map, cataloguing the useful idiots whose voices the Kremlin benefits from amplifying. Well, let's start with Steve Bannon. In Vatnik Soup, Bannon is represented as a transatlantic link, attempting to network far-right pro-Putin parties across the world, and especially in Europe and the UK, and deploying media tactics that overlap with Kremlin influence operations. Then there is Rand Paul, another extraordinary profile. Kallioniemi profiles Rand Paul as a US figure, often voting against Ukraine aid and sanctions, and aligns with many pro-Kremlin positions. Vatnik Soup also covers UK and European nodes. Increasingly, UK and European figures exhibit soft stances towards Russia or amplify Russian talking points. He vets them as nodes, not necessarily fully controlled or contracted agents of the Kremlin. This mapping blurs the line between ideological alignment and operational collaboration, which is often intentional by design. Again, we come back to the clever managing here of plausible deniability by the Kremlin and by the agents and actors themselves. There is narrative overlap, and it is important as funding. And this is the area where, with my particular interest in the sort of semantics of propaganda, this is where I think it's important to pay attention. Vatnik Soup's insight is that even without direct financial linkage, amplifying the same narratives, repeating talking points, undermining Western legitimacy, or pushing skepticism towards Ukraine and sanctions, they all contribute to the Kremlin's strategic goals, even if the figure propagating them is not an out-and-out asset agent or even necessarily a useful idiot full-time. They can be a part-time idiot in service of the Kremlin. Well, let's make some summaries here of what has been quite a sort of long and complicated and rambling episode. Right-wing authoritarian populism grows on legitimacy deficits, identity backlash, media amplification, and institutional fragility. And we are seeing a perfect storm, conjunction of these in Europe, UK, and US at this time. The Kremlin invests not always in direct control, but in creating a constellation of assets, agents, and amplifiers, and in shaping the media architecture so that disinformation becomes deeply embedded. Pop-up populist parties, UK's Reform, US insurgent movements, European challenger parties can function as de facto extensions of this architecture, whether knowingly or not. Kallioniemi's Vatnik Soup offers a heuristic: track the narrative overlap, amplification, and networked alignment. Don't just follow the cash, because if you're looking for a direct cash causal link, you'll be missing a lot of the interactions here, a lot of the network that's beneficial to the Kremlin. Democracies must strengthen transparency in party funding, media regulation, counter disinformation structures, and resilience in institutions. Because if we don't, we will see more of our democratic values and institutions hollowed out. And we will see Kremlin narratives, authoritarian narratives, tone, behavior, culture, values start to supplant those of plurality, democracy, and tolerance. And those negative values that Russia puts forward will expand into a vacuum if we don't push back, if we don't defend what we think is important. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.